Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson. I was just watching a video by someone explaining that socialism is ruining Venezuela, and if we think that it can't happen here, meaning the United States or anywhere, then, quote, you're fooling yourself. The level of ignorance on display in this video and in the "Look what socialism did to Venezuela" sound bites that proponents of a certain ideology love to throw around lately is pretty ludicrous. Let me tell you what is really destroying Venezuela and what is also creating economic devastation in the United States and in Europe and in many other parts of the world, and creating enormous suffering. And it's not socialism, it's neoliberalism. The simple-minded explanation of how socialism is ruining Venezuela in the economically ignorant video that I was watching, giving an explanation which is basically a kind of bumper sticker slogan, and one that you'll hear repeated over and over by those people who latch on to these kinds of arguments, is that, quote, socialism always works in the beginning, so people are fooled in the beginning. It's easy for governments to confiscate money, but eventually there's no more money to confiscate, unquote. This little soundbite is very convincing to listeners who don't actually understand what money is and where it comes from. They nod their heads and say, yes, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. However, anyone who repeats these little bumper sticker slogans actually reveals complete ignorance of where money comes from. Let me clue you in. A sovereign nation does not need to confiscate other people's money in order to fund social programs, or armies, or navies, or roads, or railroads, or educational institutions, or social security payments to retirees, or anything else. Just where do these economic experts on these videos who lecture us with their concerned looks on their faces think that money comes from in a modern society? Let me clue them in on a little secret. Sovereign governments who are issuers of the currency create it by crediting bank reserves, and it does not cost them anything to credit those bank reserves. They simply credit the bank reserves. I doubt that the people who wrote the script for that video that I'm talking about, or many of the others, or the people who are quoting this kind of thing on podcasts, look at Venezuela, actually even understand what bank reserves are. And it's actually a little bit complicated. It requires some getting your head around it. So don't worry, I'm not going to go into that right now in this video, but you can look it up, and it's not really a debatable point. But the point is that a sovereign government, which in a democracy is theoretically controlled by the will of the people — I understand that's not the case in a lot of places that call themselves democracies or republics, but in a sovereign country, in which in a democracy would be controlled by the will of the people, can create money. That's where the money came from in the first place. They do not need to go seize it in order to fund anything. And they're in absolutely no danger of running out of money, which that video says, oh, they're run out of money. They're in absolutely no danger of ever running out of money, period. It's actually laughable that people don't understand this fact, and yet they go out and make YouTube videos talking about economic theories. But it also reveals the fact that you have been deliberately mistaught, and people are being deliberately mistaught. They're being taught BS in their economics classes in order to create a vision of artificial scarcity, a mentality of artificial scarcity, which I'll come back to discuss later. The real problem is not creating money, People are probably already rushing ahead in their minds and saying, oh, inflation. The real problem is not creating money. The real problem is creating goods and services and natural resources for that money to purchase. If there's too much money and there's not enough production, then you're going to eventually potentially run into inflation. But it's actually the real resources of that nation which you need to be focusing in on. And that's where neoliberalism comes in. I'm not talking about liberalism, I'm talking about neoliberalism. The fact that a lot of people have never even heard that term, or it's not talked about very much, is a big clue that it's something people don't want you to look at. They want you to get afraid of all kinds of other things. Neoliberalism is the dangerous, out-of-control ideology that you need to focus on. Neoliberalism believes in seizing the resources of a nation, which I would call the gifts of the gods. The ancients recognized the resources as the gifts of the gods. But if you're uncomfortable with that, you can call them the gifts of nature to that nation if you prefer. The gifts of nature to the people of that nation. The forests, the ocean ports, the rivers, and the soil, and the mineral wealth that's under the soil. In the ancient world, these were all recognized as gifts of the gods. You can think of which god was the god of the ocean and the ports, and the god of the wealth that was under the earth, and the god of the crops and the grain, and the various gods of the rivers and goddesses. Neoliberalism, but you can call them the gifts of nature if you want. It doesn't matter. Neoliberalism argues that these gifts do not belong to the wealth of the nation, the people, but these gifts can and in fact should be seized in order to benefit a small number of people at the expense of everybody else. Neoliberalism is an economic philosophy that attempts to build wealth for some at the expense of everybody else. And it's busy attempting to do that around the globe right now, including right here in the United States, but also in Europe, where neoliberalism is absolutely out of control. And neoliberalism builds on the legacy of colonialism and imperialism in previous centuries, in which that natural wealth of huge parts of the world, including Central America, including South America, including where Venezuela is, but also including Africa, huge parts of Asia. Neoliberalism builds on that tradition of appropriating for the benefit of a privileged few at the expense of the people to whom the gods or nature gave that wealth, gave that actual wealth. Nature gave that wealth to Venezuela. Nature or the gods allowed those men and women to be born in Venezuela. That wealth belongs to the people of Venezuela or whatever nation you're in. That wealth is a gift of the gods. The problem with colonialism and the problem with neoliberalism is not, like this video that I'm quoting says, that you eventually run out of other people's money. The problem with colonialism and the problem with neoliberalism is not like these bumper sticker slogans say, that you eventually run out of other people's money. The problem with neoliberalism, which basically loots the natural resources that belong to the people, is that you eventually run out of other people's resources to loot. People who understand that a sovereign nation that is the issuer of its own currency can and does create money. That's exactly how countries like the United States or the United Kingdom or Australia are creating their money that circulates in their economies. This is not a controversial statement. This is what is going on right now. This is what is happening. It's not debatable. A sovereign issuer of currency creates the money. People who understand that the government cannot run out of money, can actually use sound economic policy to do things such as creating universities to educate the men and women of their country so that they can pursue the kinds of jobs and productive careers that will enrich the nation. They can do things like organizing to build a freeway system that will improve the economy of that nation. In fact, this kind of sound policy does not bankrupt a nation. It's exactly how the United States became so wealthy. When the University of California, for instance, the UC system, but starting with one university, the University of California, which was originally at Berkeley, the first one, when it was chartered in 1868, its founding document declared that the goal was that admission and tuition, quote, shall be free to all residents of the state, 1868. Almost 100 years later, in 1960, University of California President Clark Kerr stated again in the University of California vision for the future that he was laying out that, quote, the two governing boards reaffirm the long-established principle that state colleges and the University of California shall be tuition-free to all residents of the state. So, what was going on there? Or did the state of California, quote, run out of other people's money after 1960? Because it's certainly not operating on that principle anymore, right? But it was in 1868, 1960. So what happened? Did it run out of other people's money to grab? Even though they managed to do all right from 1868 to 1960, when the gross domestic product of California and of the United States was nowhere near the levels that those gross domestic products are today, or the economy was today? No. The people who tell you that having the government provide infrastructure such as roads and railroads and public universities constitutes running your country into the ground and using up, quote, other people's money are simply not telling you the truth. As I've already said, it can be easily proven governments who issue their own currencies don't need to use other people's money. They can issue it themselves. But there are some very obvious vested interests who would like you to not understand this. For example, the thriving student loan industry, which didn't even really exist when I was going to college, but which is currently saddling just about every student in this country with at least 10 years worth of student debt in order to get a 4-year education, even at a public university. If you think about it, that system, the people who benefit from that, can be seen to have a vested interest in your not understanding the plain fact that providing subsidized public education is entirely possible to do in this country, and that it was in fact entirely possible to do when our gross domestic product was only a tiny fraction of what it is today, and that providing things like public infrastructure such as freeways and railroads and universities actually makes a country more economically sustainable, not less. The reason Venezuela became a target to the neoliberals is that Venezuela has a tremendous bounty of natural resources that was given by the gods, or if you prefer, by nature, to the people of Venezuela. And there are certain groups, many of them completely outside of Venezuela, but some of them inside Venezuela as well, certain constituencies who want to privatize that and not give any of the benefits to the people as a whole. In fact, that very video that ignorantly or deceitfully says that Venezuela is a mess because they ran out of other people's money even admits at one point that Hugo Chavez demanded that foreign private companies pay higher percentages of royalties to the people of Venezuela for the oil they were extracting. And that made the privatizers, the neoliberals, very angry. So they decided to change that system. They decided to punish the people of Venezuela and make an example out of Venezuela for that. And for that, they didn't want that philosophy getting out of control. And because Venezuela was not a sovereign issuer of its own currency, Venezuela had a huge opening, that a wide open gap that could be exploited. You see, Venezuela, until just last month, until August of 2018, had its currency pegged to the US dollar, a foreign exchange target. It was pegged to the US dollar, and that means that Venezuela could not issue its own currency. It in fact means that it was not a sovereign issuer of its own currency. Of course, it was a sovereign country, so it could have dropped that peg to the dollar if it decided to do that, which it's now trying to do, by the way, but way too late. But that means that instead of issuing its own currency to pursue social programs in accordance with the resources which the gods or nature have blessed Venezuela, with which the gods or nature have blessed Venezuela, and in accordance with the talents and skills which the men and women of Venezuela have obtained through their educations and their work experience, instead of issuing their own currency to organize those resources that they're gifted with, the people and the resources of their country, Venezuela instead has to borrow money from the international bond markets. And that allows the bond market to effectively crush them. It's exactly the same situation that you see in the movie Barbershop, if you've ever seen that movie. When you have to go to a loan shark for money, and that loan shark doesn't really care about your barbershop, and in fact they actually covet your barbershop for themselves. Go see the movie for yourself. You'll have a better understanding of what's going on in Venezuela than most of the ignorant arguments being publicized by neoliberal mouthpieces on YouTube videos who are providing deceptive intellectual cover for neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is what is destroying economies and lives of men and women today. It has nothing to do with socialism. Many of the programs and policies that were in place in the United States for decades, and which made the United States wealthy, which built the infrastructure of this country, until those programs began to be dismantled in the 1970s, and especially beginning in the 1980s under Reagan, and continuing under every president since Reagan, neoliberal, would be ignorantly referred to as, quote, socialism. What came before neoliberalism? It would be called socialism by the makers of these deceptive videos. They say, oh yeah, socialism destroys everywhere it's been tried. Well, what about the University of California system that I told you about that lasted for 100 years? What about the interstate that you drive down every day? Those videos want you to be afraid of socialism when what you really need to learn about is neoliberalism. But there aren't too many people making videos about that. Most people haven't even heard of that term before, neoliberalism. It's a policy. Neoliberalism is a policy of artificial scarcity. And it's sustained because of deliberate lack of educating people about how economics actually works. All this talk about running out of other people's money is convincing you of artificial scarcity. It's part of a centuries-long, millennia-long campaign to make you ignorant of the ancient wisdom that was once understood on this planet. The gods have given Venezuela and the people who've been born in Venezuela, who've been gifted by nature or the gods with life in Venezuela, the nature or the gods, however you want to think about it, has gifted tremendous gifts and natural resources to the people and land of Venezuela. But they are being robbed of those resources by proponents of an absolutely abominable ideology. An ideology that says the people need austerity while we take all the resources that the gods or nature gave to all the people. The whole scheme is built on a lie. The whole scheme is built on taking other people's resources. The whole scheme will eventually collapse because eventually you run out of other people's resources. And the liars who are telling you, ooh, look over there, be afraid of socialism, are providing intellectual cover and intellectual distraction while the world is endangered by predatory neoliberalism. The problem is neoliberalism. The problem is a conspiracy against the gods or against the men and women of every country. The people of Venezuela are feeling it very painfully right now. But if you don't think neoliberalism is happening here, and by here I mean just about anywhere within the sound of my voice on this video right now, then you are fooling yourself. And the people who are putting out those videos are trying to fool you and keep you fooled.